Yes, we do.
Okay, wonderful. You have before you a robust agenda. Is there any changes or additions to that agenda? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion to approve.
This is Dwayne. Move to approve the agenda.
Thank you. Is there a second?
This is Nathan.
It's Roger, second.
Thank you. Pick your one there, Nathan, for the second. I'll just break a little bit and do it this way. Anyone opposed, say aye. Then the motion carries. And let's move on to the minutes of January 29th. Are there any corrections or additions? If not, a motion to approve. A motion to approve.
Dwayne, so move.
Thank you, Commissioner. Is there a second? Is there
This is Corey. I'll second.
Thank you, Corey. Anyone opposed to approval of last month's minutes or January minutes, please say aye. And the motion carries. Let's move on then to the property acquisition status report, item B, pages 8 through 17 in the packet. I think, Eric, that's you probably.
Yes, good afternoon, guys. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I do have a screen share up, so if you're able to follow along with that, please do. Otherwise, I think most of you probably have the PDF file of the packet as well. I'm going to scroll to page 8 in the packet on the screen here, which is the first page of our usual status report. Given the awkward nature of meeting virtually, and I guess given that we have a presentation from NDSU that we'd like to get to next, maybe we just hit a few high points here. Basically, we continue to make progress, sort of slow and steady progress. You can see that we still have quite a few blue shaded parcels south of 94 and along the southern embankment reach 1. So we're continuing to negotiate on those. We are picking up a handful of acquired parcels each month. Otherwise, it's largely plowing down the path. The rest of the slides are similar to what you've seen in the past. I guess I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'd let you review the report and certainly follow later.
Great, thank you. Anyone have any questions regarding the report? Any questions? Okay, thank you then. Let's move on to item 5, the monitoring program status report, which is item C.
Yep. Page 18 of your packet. So this is a matrix showing the, I'm going to blow that up a little bit. You can see that. So this is a matrix showing all of the parcels where we are getting access to allow for biotic and geomorphic monitoring. The parcels are, some of them are privately owned, some of them are owned by government entities. You can see that we've been working to primarily secure easements, but in some situations we've had to resort to getting rights of entries. And you can see that we are making pretty good progress. There are 377 total parcels. Currently have access to 250 plus of those. And so we are making a progress on that status report. And this is a supplemental status report that we thought we would start sharing with the board on a regular basis as well. So happy to answer any questions on this.
Questions regarding the acquisition status for the biogeomorphic studies? Anyone? I recognize that this is awkward, but feel free to jump in if anybody's got a question. This is a lot going on, so we want to make sure that we're discussing things that need to be discussed. Okay, then let's go to item 6 and look forward to hearing the presentation on the Agra study.
Yeah, so I'm going to probably give control to either Dean or Nancy in a second here. Wanted to ask Dean and Nancy from NDSU research team to give a presentation on their ag study. Of course, this might be more effective if we were in person, but we'll make do here. As you might all remember, some of you might remember, the Diversion Authority had originally hired the NDSU group back in 2014 to study the ag risks from temporary storage of water on farmland. And they produced their study. They gave a presentation to the land committee back in 2015. And then there's been a few updates of that study as time has gone by. Recently, we asked NDSU team to update that study to reflect the current project, Plan B project, which has some changes in hydrology, modeling. And today they'll be presenting a summary of their findings. The final report is not yet ready, but we felt that the presentation was ready and we wanted to give that to the land committee today. So look forward to having them walk through that. The other thing I would maybe just mention up front, when we asked NDSU to do the update, there were two parts to the updated study that they're working on. The first part was an update of the base study, and we'll go through that in a minute. And the second part is we asked them to study the risks of the wide-scale prevent plant scenario. And findings of the prevent plant scenario are almost ready. We probably could have presented that today, but our thought was we would like to come back next month and have another opportunity to present the prevent plant scenario. And so if this goes well today, an updated presentation or a second presentation next month on prevent plant. With that, Dean or Nancy, are you guys able to grab and do the screen share, or would you like me to do that for you?
Can you hear me okay, Eric?
Yep, can hear both of you.
What do I click again to get the screen up? I have the presentation ready. I just need to be able to make it so that everyone can see it.
Yep, so as on your screen there should be a little dialog box in the middle with an arrow pointing upwards that says share. And if you click that, then you should be able to select the PowerPoint file that's open on your computer. There you go.
Okay. Are we up and running then?
The floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Joining me today are other members of the team. As Eric mentioned, Nancy was identified, but Dr. Salim Sheikh has been involved with this effort since the beginning. Dr. Elvis Benby joined the team a couple years ago. All of us have been jointly working on this project over the last 6 months to kind of take another fresher look at what might be happening in the staging area now that the location and overall design of that has changed. I've got a number of slides here, and I recognize this is probably not the best medium by which to go through a lot of stuff, but I know that there are some people here that are new to the committee, others that have not seen this material for quite some time, and that we have really pulled together quite a wide range of materials that go into this analysis. So the first part of the presentation, I'd like to kind of bring everybody up to speed. And then the second half, we'll take a little bit deeper dive into what some of the things that we're finding from this study. So just to bring everybody up to speed, we had a pretty narrow scope. We're looking at how temporary water storage in the staging area would affect planting delays. And we're looking at that from basically three different perspectives. One is how likely or how frequent could producers expect to experience planting delays if the staging area is activated or used? If they do incur a planting delay, what are the revenue losses associated with that? That would be the magnitude. And then the geography, knowing that not all of the lands within the staging area are affected equally with every flood. One of the takeaways we found with our previous work was that we kind of got a much better understanding of how the flooding process matches up to regional planting, and that I think really helped the dialogue move forward. Prior to that point, there wasn't a lot of empirical work that was done to match up those two issues. So A lot of what we have today is a refinement from some of that original work. This is our analytical outline. This is something that has been kept constant throughout all of the studies. We bring three main pieces of information together. One is the hydrology. That's what's happening to the land in the staging area. We have historical data on when planting can start, planting rates, and then we have economic factors which look at crop prices, yields, decline functions, when producers would switch to another crop, and so on. This all feeds into a simulation where we try to look at different combinations of what might happen during any given flood based on the parameters that we got for data. So one of the things that we want to touch on here is the hydrology information that was given to us. I think is very helpful, and it reveals a lot about what we're working with in terms of the actual physical effects that are taking place on the land. What we did with that data is we placed it into a timeline, because from that data we know the day when the staging area is activated. We can measure how long it takes for the water to leave that land, and then we can add in a dry down period, and then after that dry down period we then have a date where we can either begin planting or we have to wait for regional planting to start. We used two dry down periods in this study, a 10-day period and a 14-day period. In our previous work we only looked at a 10-day period. Now the nice thing about this information that you see here is we have it for the without diversion condition. In other words, what happens on that land if the diversion staging area is not built or the diversion does not operate. And then we have that same thing for the conditions with the diversion. So what that tells us then is we can identify a bunch of different conditions that occur on those lands for the different flood sizes that we have hydrology data information for. We've identified 5 different types of effects of flooding, and those storage areas are placed into those groups for purposes of presenting the results. So we have land that does not flood. We have lands that in the staging area for various sized events do not flood. We have some tracts of land where the water on the land will be the same duration with the diversion as without. We obviously have some tracts of land that will now experience flooding that lasts longer. We have a few minor circumstances where the addition of culverts or other water conveyance ditches and stuff maybe mitigate some of that flooding slightly shorter. And then, of course, we have lands they would not flood, and they do flood now. The thing that's kind of interesting when we look at this data is that we have 241 individual pieces or storage areas, and the flood effects on those 241 storage areas vary across all 10 flood events. So that makes making generalizations kind of difficult. One thing to keep in mind is that these groups describe the type of flooding, what the flooding effects are, the difference between flooding with and without the diversion. It does not correlate with how long the water is on the land. Okay, so that's a different measure. The graph you see here is the storage area acres, 54,450, I think is a pretty close number. The blue areas are lands that are not adversely affected. Okay, that this was land that would not flood or floods the same or floods shorter, or however the hydrology suggests that water will move more quickly. The red areas are the areas that are adversely affected. Those are areas that either flood longer or have new flooding on those lands. We take a closer look at those areas that are adversely affected. The vast majority of those acres, as you see in these green tinted portions of each of these bars, the green area represent lands that flood longer. Generally speaking, the vast majority of those lands flood 1 to 5 days longer, or the inundation period is 1 to 5 days longer than it would be without. The smaller, more colored, variated areas on top of each of these bars, those are the areas that flood, that have new flooding. and they tend to have a much greater degree of difference between obviously no flooding and with the diversion. The numbers that are presented here in this graphic are 14-day dry down. We do have the 10-day, but the 10-day numbers would be slightly less for the areas that do not flood. Keep in mind that if the land already floods, the dry down period applies to that scenario as much as it applies to when the diversion is used. So for some of these tracts of land, the dry down period may move things a little bit, but it doesn't represent a large increase in the delay that producers might experience. We have a number of factors in our analysis that are allowed to vary depending upon what the historical data is telling us. And these are very critical to getting kind of a realistic portrayal of what could happen, considering that we're dealing with a lot of weather-related events. We know that floods do not occur on the same calendar date every year. In fact, we do know from the data that there is a range of dates under which the staging area would be triggered. In other words, the gates would close or the water would start accumulating in the staging area. We use the past data then to give us a range of what we think the most likely dates would be. That's that graph on the right. So that goes into our model as one of the factors that we allow to vary in our analysis. The other two factors that vary based on historical data are when planting can begin. We know that planting doesn't begin on the same day or the same week every year. We also know that planting rates change. We have cold, wet springs, we have dry springs, we have a number of factors which affect the capacity of producers to put a crop in the ground. Both of those factors are allowed to change in the model as well. We use planting progress rate for sugar beets to represent when we think wheat, corn, and sugar beets can be planted. We have similar data like this for soybeans, but we didn't present it for sake of brevity. Here now is a visualization when we start placing those different components on a same timeline. In other words, we look at these calendar dates down here. We can see the blue bars to the left are when we think the flood will occur, and you can see that the most often dates are basically that first week in April. You can see we have red bars that indicate when we think planting can begin for wheat, sugar beets, and corn, and then the green is when soybeans come in. Notice that the statistical analysis here does produce some overlap. We take those overlaps out if they happen to conflict with each other. In other words, we know that corn planting can't start if we're still in a flood. So this is kind of a gathering of those moving pieces. Talking a little bit about the agricultural production factors, we have yield reduction functions based on target yields. These measure kind of the yield penalty that producers will have the later into the spring they go in terms of being able to put the crop in. We also have agronomic dates in the model that tell us when producers will switch from corn and wheat to soybeans, when producers might quit planting, and then those acres would go into PP. We have crop prices. We're modeling 4 crops: corn, wheat, sugar beets, and soybeans. And we also developed a lot of these metrics and parameters were from over the previous studies have been based on NDSU specialists, and we did have a focus with producers to vet some of these issues with the producers that are operating in the staging area. So those are kind of some of the key components that go into the analysis.
Excuse me, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. If someone doesn't have their phone on mute, I hear some banging in the background. Would you please mute it? Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, I'm just curious, does everybody know that they can follow this on the live streaming? I'm just assuming they do, but it took me a little bit to figure that out.
Well, I don't know that, John. I figured it out, which it just sort of showed up in front of me. That is an advantage for those of you that are just calling in on your phone. If you do get this going on your computer, it really it's pretty slick. It's almost like being there. So hopefully people can play around with your computers and figure out how to use this, because it's a great tool.
Thank you.
One of the things we may be able to do next month is we may be able to revisit some of the materials that some of the people were not able to see, and maybe some of those materials can be handed out in advance on paper. We'll make sure that anybody who wants to see the detail that we've got here has a chance to look at it and get a copy. So how does, go ahead.
No, and I don't want to interrupt the presentation, but yes, I think we should discuss that. It's there's something about having paper that you can highlight and so on and so forth, at least for some of us, but this is great. So go ahead and continue, please.
I think it's important now that we've got a feel for all of the things that we pulled together, really how does it work, or how do we actually determine if there's a planting delay? Understanding that will help, I think, you guys understand maybe the results a little bit better. So I've got two examples presented here, just conceptually, that we have a flood start that's modeled. Those are in the far left in the blue. The land is flooded, the water leaves the land, we have a dry down period, and then we have, at some point in this process, the spring advances far enough along that regional planting starts. And so the condition above would be one where we've modeled the effects of flooding to be over on that tract of land. The water has left. We've given it its allocated dry down, whether it's 10 days or 14 days, but no regional planting has started. So in that case, there wouldn't be a delay, because the general conditions throughout the region are not good enough yet for planting to begin. The second example is where we come in now in the model and we start measuring the days that are involved between these dates. And we would see here that regional planting in the second example already starts in the region, but that tract of land is not ready to plant. And so we would then begin measuring those delays and accumulating how those delays would affect yields and revenue. So it's kind of a mechanical assessment of kind of how we go about piecing all these pieces together. Keep in mind that not every delay will translate into a revenue loss. We are modeling a period of time in the spring that we consider to be optimal. This was provided to us by the agronomists. If we have a delay within that period, some of these tracts maybe have a 1 or a 2 day delay, and they get started and that land gets planted before they're out of that optimal period, they were delayed, but they weren't penalized. And we have other conditions like the last one where we have a substantial delay, where in the absence of the diversion, they would have gotten most of their crop in a timely manner, and because of the diversion, they're getting it in, but at a substantial penalty for getting it in late. These are kind of a couple the mechanics of how it works. So I'd like to spend the rest of the time now on what we're learning from this exercise, what we're finding out from what the data can say when we put all this together. So here we have some results for tracts of land that flood longer. In other words, these lands would flood without the diversion, but when we run the staging area for these larger floods, the water is held on the land and it's on the land longer. So when we look at the 5 floods that I've identified here, the 25-year XL, which is an attempt to model the 1997 flood, a 50-year event, the 2009 event, which was a large event here about 10 years ago, and a 100-year event. We can see that there's greater than a 50% chance on these tracts of land that there's a flooding delay if they were to have that particular size flood. In other words, in some cases, like with the 1997 flood, there's a 100% chance those lands will have some planting delay. That's all this is telling us, is if they could incur a planting delay. Now, when we go from the 10-day to the 14-day, we can see that the frequency in some cases, it goes up. But in the case of group 3 here, you can see that does the odds of having a larger revenue loss per acre change a lot? It doesn't change a lot, and we'll see some more numbers to that effect. But suffice to say, these tracts of land have a high probability of incurring some planting delays for any of these flood events, and that's based on our 10,000 simulations. This is the same information now presented for those tracts of land that flood, that have new flooding. This is the group 5 tracts. Here what we're seeing is that the frequency at which these tracts of land may incur a flooding delay is a little lower. Okay, so they're not as likely to incur a planting delay as frequently as the other tracts, but you can see the percentage of the time that they may have a planting delay that causes greater than $25 an acre is considerably higher. So we're seeing that these tracts of land, perhaps frequency is lower, magnitude of losses could be higher. Now, I need to emphasize that the numbers you see here are for all tracts of land within this category and averaged for all crops. So keep that in mind, that when we say that there's a chance of a planting delay, we're not implying that all 4 crops would be delayed. It's just that there may be one crop that ends up with a delay, and that's counted as one chance in the way that this data is gathered. So the probability overall is about 50% with a 10-day dry down. That goes up between 50 and 75% with a 14-day dry down. Now, keep in mind that the model that we ran takes a look at 10,000 different combinations, and so we can see patterns that will emerge from the data that will give us an indication of how likely something is to happen. We're dealing with weather after all, and so I mean it's not we can't give you a point number and say every year the flood will occur on this date and planting will start here and this is the number. So what you see here is you see revenue losses for corn with a 14-day dry down on areas that flood longer and areas with new flooding. Now what we've done is I've gone in and I've pulled out the 5% of the combinations that are the worst for the producer. In other words, a late flood, an early start to planting season, and a slow planting rate are probably the combinations that we're looking at. And you can see here that across the 5 floods that we've presented here, we have 10 in the paper, but 5 for brevity, we're looking at between $20 and $30 an acre for planting delays in those worst conditions. In the average conditions, we're probably 5 to 10. The best conditions, there are no planting delays. So we do still have within the model combinations that produce conditions that don't produce a planting delay. It's not inevitable. It's more or less needs to be looked at in terms of a likelihood. When we move to the areas that have new flooding, you can see here that we have the magnitude, as we alluded to in the previous slides. You can see here that across those flood types, now we're looking at losses that are approaching $60 to $70 an acre. Those would be worst case conditions. The averages now are probably between 10 and 20. So they're up from the other averages for the other lands and still, quite a bit lower than the worst case. It helps, this graphic, I think, helps frame kind of the fact that we're dealing with a range of conditions with what the data is telling us, and that if we put things only in averages, it sometimes can mask what can happen on either end of that spectrum. This is the same slide for wheat. You can see a very similar pattern here where we have losses approaching $20 an acre in the worst case scenarios for those acres that, or for those tracts of land that flood longer, averages around $10 an acre, and there are conditions again that produce no damages. When we look at the areas of new flooding, the worst situations for those tracts of land produce losses approaching $80 to $90 an acre. And the average condition under those circumstances is going to be about a $20 per acre loss. Looking at sugar beets, keep in mind that wheat, corn, and sugar beets are using the same planting start dates and the same planting rates. So we are going to see some similarity among the results for those three crops. The difference with sugar beets is that because it's such a high value crop, the scale on this graph shows that these losses are considerably higher for sugar beets than they would be for wheat and corn. And some of that too is due to the penalties that the sugar beet yields have with the delays in planting. So you can see here delays probably 25 to 30 are on average for those floods, those lands that flood longer, approaching $50 on average for those lands that have new flooding. And again, we do have conditions in the model, the better circumstances from a producer standpoint that do not produce any planting delays. Looking at soybeans, this is a key driver for a large part of the numbers that we've got and the numbers that people have seen is that we have a high percentage of the acreage in the staging area that gets planted to soybeans. But what we're finding is that the effects of flooding on those tracts of land within the staging area are largely gone well before regional planting for soybean starts. So it stands to reason that we're not seeing much delays with soybeans. And the rationale here is if we have a flood that starts in April, the water's off the land on the 15th, and we give it another 10 days, that's the 25th. If we go to the end of the month, it's April 30th. That's 30-some days from when the activation of the staging area began. We seldom start planting soybeans at that point in time. So if we go to, the middle of May and soybean planting starts, but soybean planting is delayed at that point, we can't attribute any delays at that stage of the planting cycle to what the diversion does. So, there's quite a bit of the averaging that we see takes into account that 50% of the acres probably have little or no planting delays. So, getting into the sensitivity of the dry down, we had the chance with this study to look specifically at two dry down periods. The 10-day dry down period was what producers said was a reasonable number with the very first study we did 5 years ago, and we've retained that in the subsequent studies we've did. This time around, we wanted to look and see, increasing that dry down period, does that make a big effect on the frequency and the magnitude of planting delays? If we look at the numbers in this table, for those lands that flood longer, the actual dollar value per acre is not real large. Again, this kind of comes back to this averaging that we have when we bring in soybeans. But look at the percent change. It does have a big effect. But of course, some of that is you have to temper those numbers with understanding that if you go from 1 to 2, you have a 100% increase, but the magnitude is still relatively low. When we go from 10 to 14-day dry down, what does that have on the probability that they'll have a planting delay? And what's really interesting about this is across both tracts of land, or both types of flooding, the flood longer land and the new flooding land, they have about a 15 to 16% increase in the chance that they'll have a flooding or they'll have a planting delay. So it does increase the frequency and it does increase the magnitude. So we can come away from this just by even presenting these averages that the dry down requirements are going to affect the planting delays or the revenue losses experienced by the producer. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to let this particular parameter vary like we do with the flood starts and the planting rates. We just don't have any data on that. We don't know how often the dry down period will be 10 days, how often it'll be 14. Is there a chance it could be more than that? Is there a chance it could be as few as 7 days? we're left to modeling this with just these two numbers for the time being. Do not worry about the numbers in the graph here or this table. This was presented as an example of the type of detail that we do have available in the main report, and we have this available at a level of detail that people can go in and track what's happening across all of these different flood events based on an individual storage area. But what I did circle here is that what you've seen to this point in the presentation and the material that we brought forward today is looking at things that are categorized by the type of flooding. Does it flood longer? Is it new flooding? We also have all of this information delineated in the main report based on the difference in total days, which in some cases is going to be a much more meaningful number for the producers. So if the producer realizes that in their storage area, it looks like the delay is going to be 16 to 20 days, we have how often the model will tell them that they'll have a loss of a certain size. We have that broken out by crop. There's an extensive amount of data that will be available in that report that will serve as a resource for not only the land committee but the appraisal people and the producers as well. So I'm kind of going to move to the conclusions a little bit here. What is the fundamental factor that's driving what we're seeing with the economic results? And this was something that we brought forward with the previous studies we did, and that is when we look at the data, we look at when the floods occur and we bring in the hydrology data, and then we look at the crop progress data and we figure out when does that happen. The period when the effects of flooding are largely gone, and that includes the dry down period, and when regional plantings start are very closely aligned, meaning that we're right about exactly overlapping. So what does that mean? That means that if we move this dry down period a couple days one way or the other, we move in and out of planting delays. And subtle shifts in when the crop can be planted and when the crop isn't planted will either produce no delays or will produce delays. So we have a high frequency, and that's because these two periods are very similar. If we had a condition where the effects of flooding are gone, and let's say the floods all of a sudden for some unforeseen reason are over with at the end of March, and it's still cold enough we can't plant, we'd have a different set of conclusions because it would take a much more adverse set of conditions to produce planting delays. But this is one of the key fundamental factors that's driving the results. And as long as the hydrology that's being provided, the best hydrology that's available, when we measure this on a timeline and we measure when planting can start, if those factors don't fundamentally change, we're going to come up with similar conclusions as this issue is continually discussed. So some additional observations that you guys can think about. The hydrology data, which is the best information available right now on what is going to happen on those lands. There's a substantial amount of acreage in these flood events within the staging area that are not adversely affected. That's the hydrology data that's telling us that. Of those acres that are affected, the majority of those acres are affected by 1 to 5 days. So we're not seeing huge delays between when those lands could be planted if the diversion wasn't used and when those lands could be planted when the diversion is used. Some storage tracts will have substantial adverse effects. Some of that gets masked in the averaging, but suffice to say we have all that detail in the main report so that those specifics do not have to get overlooked. It's difficult to present all of the things that are coming out of this model in a 20-minute presentation. We could spend an hour and go through the nuances, but suffice to say, there are some areas that will have larger losses than others, and they will have it on a more frequent basis. Looking at the economic and historical data that we've pulled together over the last 5 years and looked at it, as I mentioned earlier, a big chunk of what we're coming up with for damages is tied back to that we've got 50% of the land in soybeans, and soybeans is a crop that gets planted later into the spring. Usually the effects of flooding are long over with, or at least we would hope that the man-made aspects of that flooding are long over with. That's driving a lot of the results. So for any one of these storage areas, 50% of the land in that storage area on any given flood event may not experience any planting delays. That makes it difficult to understand what might happen if the flood occurs the year the guy is going to plant corn versus the year when the guy was going to plant soybeans. So these are things to kind of keep in mind. The losses that we've seen with the way that we've structured the analysis do suggest that the dry down requirements are capable of changing some of the frequency and magnitude of those losses. So we can conclude with some pretty strong certainty that dry down is going to have an effect on the producers. Unfortunately, we don't have a good way of saying exactly what that time period will be, but we do know that it's a factor in the analysis. I think what we're looking at here when we looked at those worst case scenarios was that combinations of long or late occurring floods and relatively earlier planting start dates are really the combinations that are producing the worst results. When we have a flood like 97, we notice that the results from the 97 based hydrology modeling produce damages that were greater than the 100-year flood. We have a 10, a 20, a 25, a 50, a 100, a 500, a PMF, and a 2009. Those ones that are not modeled after an actual event are what the hydrology folks call synthetic events. They're based on the best interpretation of what the flood would look like. When we look at examples of what's happened with actual floods, it's probably much more likely that the characteristic of the flood will influence the damages more than the overall size of the flood. So those are, again, more nuances to take into consideration. I know that we wanted to save time for questions. I think we have all of the research team available.
Hey, Dean, this is Eric. Thanks for your presentation. I'm going to move this along here. We're going to be running short of time. We have a hard stop at 4 o'clock for everybody's awareness.
Okay.
Probably short on time, and I know some of you have the screen up and you can see the slides, some of you don't. I did email this out, and we will make sure it's up on the project website as well for everybody to read. And as I mentioned earlier, next month we will have, I guess what I'm planning is to have the NDSU group come in and talk about the prevent plant model and analysis that they've done. And so between now and then, if the committee members have questions or comments on this, certainly jot those down, and maybe we can address those and maybe carve out a little bit more time next month. Not to cut off any discussion here today, but I know there are a few other things on our committee agenda that we'd like to get to. So I guess, Mary, I'd maybe turn it to you if you had any final thoughts or comments on this.
No, I really appreciate the presentation. It's fascinating. I look forward to hearing, especially from some of our producer members, Jenny and Roger, anybody else, some input on this. But again, we don't have a lot of time here. Also, just mention for the minutes that Commissioner Campbell has joined us and was listening in on the presentation as well. So with that, can we move on to the next item? What are we looking at? 7, Flowage Easement Study, Phase 1B.
Maybe just one closing comment here. I guess thanks to Dean and Nancy and Salim and Elvis for their work on this. Appreciate the presentation. This presentation does feed into the next agenda item, which is the Flowage Easement Study. And if you recall, we've talked about this at numerous meetings in the past. We've had Crown Appraisals do a Phase 1 report. They finished that in late 2018. And now here, of course, some time has passed, and we've asked Crown to update that Phase 1 report. The Phase 1 report will take the information from the NDSU study that you just heard about. It will take additional information that has occurred over the last couple of years and produce an updated phase 1 report. We're calling it phase 1B. And this will really be a foundation for future evaluation of actual flowage easements. And so the task order is in your packet here. Basically, Crown is going to be sort of re-looking at the regression model and the paired sales that they had analysis that they had completed in the first report, producing an updated version of that that reflects Plan B and all the current information about the project. This task order is within the authorization level that Joel has as executive director. And so I believe he was planning to approve this, but we wanted to just at least make sure that the land committee was aware that this was happening. And if you had any initial questions, we could address those at this time.
Thank you. Do you need any recommendation from this committee for that?
I don't know if we need it, but it would be great if this committee sort of supported the action here.
Okay, questions from any committee members? Comments? A lot of information, but you know, this is something we've all been waiting for a long time. These are the questions that a lot of the landowners have wanted answered. So I'm happy that we can finally move forward with it. Anybody out there that wants to join in or motion? Could I get a motion to recommend that we move forward with the flowage easement study?
This is Wayne Brightling, and I would so move.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Kevin Campbell. Kevin Campbell, second.
Thank you, Kevin. Any further discussion? All those opposed to the motion say aye. The motion carries. Let's move on to the mitigation plan. We've just got 10 minutes or so.
Yeah. I'll introduce this, and Joel maybe has some comments as well. In your packet on page 23 is the page from our draft mitigation plan that relates to zoning downstream of the southern embankment. And the reason why this section exists in our mitigation plan, if you read through that, you'll see that both the DNR and the Office of State Engineer in North Dakota have looked at these, basically the fact that we are constructing a dam, and it's been called a high hazard dam by some of those agencies. They're concerned about zoning immediately downstream of the dam, and there have been some concerns about should there be restrictions on development. Both permitting agencies have advised and basically made some recommendations that there should be zoning restrictions downstream of the dam. Those are recommendations from both the DNR. The state engineer in North Dakota has recommended sound development downstream of the embankment. And so in light of those recommendations, what our proposed mitigation approach would be to notify the appropriate zoning authorities in all of those locations and make sure that those zoning authorities, zoning officials were well aware of these recommendations. The Diversion Authority does not have zoning authority, and so we don't really have a way to control what does or does not happen downstream of the dam, but we certainly have an opportunity to notify those who do have zoning authority. And so in your packet here, that's the one page from the mitigation plan. Following that is a one page from the North Dakota permit, and then following that is a one page from the Minnesota permit showing the different permit conditions related to this matter. Joel had asked that we bring this forward to the committee for a little bit of discussion, and I'd open the floor to that.
Zoning authority in Cass County would go to the township for much of that area. How does it work in Clay County?
This is Kevin. I think we have similar. Typically, the townships in Minnesota, they typically adopt zoning ordinances. certainly can create the more restrictive, but not be less restrictive than what county ordinances are for zoning. And but I certainly these items we should run these by our planning and zoning department and probably give a heads up to our Clay County planning so that they're aware of what these statements are, especially when it comes to our side regarding the Minnesota DNR, what they say regarding it. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Mary.
Sure.
I would agree. This is Jenny Mojo. It's in order to get a building permit, you need to get township and county approval. And so making sure that we have all the affected townships in Clay County and then the planning director aware as well. That's what would be needed.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any comments or questions for Eric? So Eric, what are the next steps then?
Well, I guess based on that feedback, I'm kind of thinking that we should probably try to put this issue on both the Cass County and Clay County planning commissions for their awareness, and just make sure that they are aware of the diversion authority, aware of the recommendations from the state permitting agencies, and then also aware of the diversion authority's suggested approach for notification. And if there's any feedback from those planning boards, then we could adjust accordingly. I think that probably is a good next step.
And I would suggest, have you had any conversation with Stanley Township?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Joel.
The diversion would recommend to the Land Management Board that I think we send out a formal letter to all zoning jurisdictions that are applicable for the downstream impacts here. And at that point, I think we would make ourselves available to attend any commission meetings or township meetings as requested to discuss this issue in more depth with the zoning boards that have jurisdiction. And I just want to note to the Land Management Committee that there has been a number of entities and individual property owners who have provided inquiry on, and they are looking for direction. There's a few construction projects that are potentially in the works that need some guidance on this issue. So Eric and I felt it was appropriate to bring it to Land Management at this time so that we can have this discussion and move forward with some sort of a recommendation from the Land Management Committee, so we can provide some clarity to folks out there that need it.
Very good. I think communication is key, talking to, both sides of the river and all the townships or communities that we need to engage on this. Anyone else?
Mary, this is Chris McShane.
Yes, Chris.
One thing to be aware of with respect to zoning is it does open up the possibility of what's called a regulatory taking. So if you eliminate all potential use of that property, then you run into a problem where you may end up having to pay for the use that it was supposed to be, or the highest use that it could have been. There's some nuance with that with respect to a zoning that doesn't take away all economic use, and that likely would be a fight that we would have to go through with most of these, because it still would remain with its current economic use, which is agricultural.
What about future use?
Well, that's the nuance and the argument that's out there. There's a pretty broad United States Supreme Court precedent about what a regulatory taking is. It's far more common to have a regulatory taking throughout the rest of the country than it is to actually have a physical taking.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, Eric, I think you have your direction. Do you need any action from us?
I think we've got pretty good direction. As long as there's no opposition to that path forward, we'll proceed.
Okay, we look forward to hearing back from you. Dan, let's move on to item 9, the committee update.
Yeah, I guess I realize that the board meeting tomorrow is going to be short and sweet, and so there are no actual committee updates planned at the board meeting. But if you are interested, I did include in this meeting's packet on page 27 a few bullet points that we would normally share with the diversion board. And so, Joel, I'll leave it up to you or Mary if you want to share that with the board members. Otherwise, it's just sort of a routine update that we would have provided.
Sure. What about this egg study? I think, when do we plan on sharing that with the rest of the board? I think we'll have great interest in it.
Yeah, I think what we're going to do is we're going to post the presentation online. We're also working on a summary 1 or 2 page informational sheet that would be distributed to the board members. Obviously, lots and lots of gory detail in the report, and that's what we were looking for with the research study. But I know we didn't have time this month to present that to the full board. So our thought was we would just share with them the sort of high-level findings and make the presentation available.
Okay, very good. Then very quickly, let's, anything from the Cass County Joint Board? I know you guys have been busy. Or the Minnesota Board? Kevin, you got anything there?
Mary, we are planning on meeting the same way tomorrow at 1 o'clock. I think there's just a couple of things that Eric has that he'd like to see some immediate action on, but I think it's going to be a pretty light meeting tomorrow.
Okay, great. Well, then maybe you can report to the
And this is
Go ahead.
Sorry, Mary, this is Roger. Yeah,
Yes.
And we meet tomorrow too. If you look in your packet, you'll see some of the activities that have happened since the last meeting. And just nothing else to report. Things are going okay.
Great, thank you. Anything from MetroCog?
Mary?
Yes.
Mary, just briefly here, just a message to Eric. I intend to be at the courthouse tomorrow for that 1 o'clock meeting along with Steve Larson. So yep. We'll be calling in from there.
Fair enough. Sounds good.
Great, okay. Thank you. Anything from MetroCog? Okay, any other business? Oh, look at that, 4 o'clock. Next meeting's April 25th. I imagine we'll be doing it the same way. But in the meantime, everybody stay well. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
And there's a second?
Second by Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. All opposed, say aye.